Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of OpenObservability Talks. I'm your host, Dotan Horvitz, and here at OpenObservability Talks, we talk about anything DevOps, observability, and open source. So may the open source be with you. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Logs.io, the cloud-native observability platform. Logs.io takes the best-of-breed open source projects, such as Prometheus, OpenSearch, and Jaeger, and offers them as a unified observability platform built for scale. For those joining the live stream on YouTube or Twitch, feel free to share questions and comments on the chat to make things more interesting. And with that, let's move on to today's episode. And actually, today is a very special episode. Today is the closing episode of our 4th season. Hard to think that we've been running for 4 years already. Amazing. And for this special episode, we have a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I call it the open source turning to the dark side. Yeah, I know the theme with the Star Wars and all that. Anyway, in the past few years, we've witnessed tectonic shifts in open source, with established projects taken off open source and modified in all sorts of various ways. We just saw that with Redis, that moved away from open source just a couple of months ago. And on the other hand, we've seen active forks aiming to keep these projects open, gaining momentum, like OpenSearch and OpenTofu that we covered here on the show, and now also the new fork for Redis, Valky. On this episode, I want to discuss these shifts, what they mean for us as plain users and for the free and open source software movement in general. Is this a trend, just a passing wave, or really something more meaningful than that? And most importantly, what we can learn from it as vendors and as a community. And for that, I have an open source pundit, David Nalley. David is a director of open source strategy at AWS, and currently serves as the president of the Apache Software Foundation and serves on the board of directors for the Internet Security Research Group, and many other titles that he will soon share with us, and brings a ton of experience in open source. So let me invite David to the stream. Hey, David, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's an honor. I've seen you on stage presenting the latest and greatest on the Apache Foundation in several occasions in previous years and things like that. So definitely looking up to you for knowledge and for insight. So great to have you here on the show. And where are you joining us from?
So I live in the middle of nowhere in South Carolina on the east coast of the U.S.
Yeah, and you gave an amazing anecdote that it's the middle of nowhere, but you have probably one of the best internet connections throughout the U.S. or the world, I think.
I certainly, it's certainly the best that I have ever had. So while I live out in the middle of nowhere, the electric co-op that provides electricity to the area that I'm in, they became an internet provider during the pandemic, the early days of the pandemic. And I now have fiber, 1 gig synchronous fiber connection coming right into my office, which, you know, I do really live in the middle of nowhere. It's 20 or 30 minutes to my closest grocery store, so it's kind of out in the sticks, but it's the fastest internet I have ever had at a residence. So it's quite amazing.
Well, some of the benefits from COVID, at least someone enjoyed that period, the upgrade for the internet connection.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I tried summarizing some of your titles, but maybe you can tell us a bit about your open source background.
Yeah, so I still have this self-image as a recovering sysadmin. So my early days in technology, I was a sysadmin for everything from boutique law firms to large multinational manufacturing companies, to obviously tech companies, ISVs, and the like. And I got involved in open source for 2 reasons. One, to solve some of my own problems. I needed things to work a specific way, and open source allowed me to modify things and fix bugs on my own. And then second, I was in the middle of nowhere in South Carolina, which is contrary perhaps to popular opinion, is not the tech hub on the East Coast. And so open source also opened up a lot of opportunities for me to explore a little more. So that's why I originally got started in open source. I ended up finding a number of communities that helped me develop and become either a better developer or a better systems operator. And so it kept opening up new opportunities for me. And that goes back to early days of the Fedora Linux project and some activities there. I did some work on what I think is now a defunct open source project called Open Groupware that was primarily coming out of Germany at the time. But all of those allowed me to expand my skill set and build relationships with this amazing community of folks who were focused on solving their own problems and improving their current day-to-day activities. So I ended up serving on the Fedora Projects Board for a couple of terms. I wrote lots of documentation, packaged lots of software, and worked on their infrastructure team for a while. That opened up some jobs, and one of those was working on an open source project called CloudStack, which I went to go work for a startup is the long and short of it. And that startup ended up getting acquired. So then I went to go work for a large tech company. And that tech company said, you know what, we think the right place for this software is the Apache Software Foundation. And so I, along with a number of others, were tasked with making sure that our relationship with the Apache Software Foundation was healthy and that CloudStack was going to be a success. And frankly, one of the things that I'm most proud of is that CloudStack still exists, even after the company that I was working for, which was the large tech company in that particular community, decided to decrease its investment and pull back from it. That community is still going on. They just had a conference, a CloudStack conference, not too long ago. They're still cranking out releases. People are still using it, and I am encouraged that they were able to build and maintain a very healthy community that survived one of the larger commercial entities pulling out from it.
Yeah, that's sustainability. And that's also your bridge into, as you said, the Apache Foundation that led you all the way now to your current role as in the presidency.
Yes, I do blame Rich Bowen. He came to me and he said, I think you might be good at this one particular role. Why don't you take this on? And I said, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. And before I knew it, I was doing lots and lots of things with the Apache Software Foundation. And I occasionally joke that he is responsible for hoodwinking me into taking on lots of responsibility. But he did an amazing job of constantly looking out for members of the community who he could get more involved. And I think I'm very thankful that he did that with me, but I've also seen him do that with a number of other folks. And I think open source communities are heavily dependent upon people like that who recognize that it's not just technology, but it's how you figure out how to make the organization sustain itself. And that requires a constant influx of new people who are interested in working on it.
Definitely. And we will definitely touch upon that as part of the chat today. So as I mentioned in the opening, the topic is, I guess I called the episode FOSS in Flux, or as I call it, open source turning to the dark side. Let's start with the hottest news in the topic. Redis relicensing just a couple of months ago in March 2024. Actually, it's a funny story. Actually, I came back from San Francisco. I was there talking at Scale and SREcon, and I gave a talk there about open source turning to the dark side with relicensing case studies and all of that. And then when I landed back home, I opened the news and I saw about Redis. So can you share with the audience, especially ones that were not aware, what's the gist, why it happened, what happened, and obviously what it means for the Redis community, for the Redis users, and for the ecosystem?
Sure. So Redis is a key value store database or a NoSQL database. It's incredibly popular. For a long time, it has been the #1 on DB engines for NoSQL databases. It's been around 15 plus years, maybe longer than that. So incredibly fascinating platform that folks have been using as a key value store and in other configurations as well. And it was originally licensed under the BSD 3-clause license, so very permissive. It was started by a single developer. That developer, created something amazing. An ecosystem came up around that, including some companies who were offering services and doing additional development. But very healthy developer community around this project. It kind of became the default for a number of programming languages. If you were using Ruby, you were probably using Redis at the time. So very healthy, prolific community that came out of this. Company ended up coming in and essentially compensating the original developer, and essentially said, we'd like to buy all of the intellectual property and things of that nature. And they ran the project. The project continued to be run by, in a BDFL, or a benevolent dictator for life mode, with that single developer running it for a long time. As he decided he wanted to go work on different things, that project ended up being led by a group of 5 maintainers. And so there were 5 people that essentially came in to replace the benevolent dictator and started making lots of decisions. Fast forward to this year, when we hit March and April, and we ended up in a situation where the company that had bought all of the intellectual property from the original developer, that now owned the trademark for the project, and
that's Redis Labs.
Redis Labs.
They rebranded Redis, so they're now synonymous with the open source itself. So
yep, and so Redis Lab, or now Redis Limited, is that company, and they made the announcement that future versions were going to be made available under 2 different licenses, neither of which meets the open source definition. And so there was a lot of shock, as you might imagine, for something that is really foundational to a lot of platforms and is used very ubiquitously, especially in places like Node and Ruby. And so there was kind of this immediate shock. And I mentioned there was a very healthy community, and I want to reiterate that. Over the past years, people have come up to help maintain Redis, and there was a very healthy, vibrant community that was contributing heavily. And a number of those folks who were that those 5 maintainers of Redis, there were 2 of those people who were not employed by Redis Limited or Redis Inc. And those 2 people started with a fork in their own personal GitHub space, and the community kind of coalesced around it. And the next thing you know, that community has created their own identity, has moved the project to the Linux Foundation. And what you know today is Valky is really the continuation of that Redis developer community. Just because they no longer had control of the trademark, they moved to a different name.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I've been following quite a few of those, but seeing this so quickly and so impressively, and also as a foundation. So also the paperwork of joining a foundation, everything, and you and I know that with all the benefits of foundations, they also have the heavy process that comes along. So that's amazing. And actually, I should share with the audience that next episode is going to be entirely dedicated to Valky, with Kyle Davis, who runs the community and the chief advocate for the project, also a member of AWS in addition. So we'll have a zoom in on that, but I definitely want to look at this as a case study to the topic that we talk about today, because Valky is obviously not an isolated incident. We've witnessed many instances of established open source, sometimes, as you mentioned, a decade old or even older than that, being relicensed to non-open source. So we've seen Elasticsearch, we've seen more recently Terraform and Vault and Consul and all the other HashiCorp stack. We've seen it with Akka and many more. And I even wrote a blog post some years ago asking if vendor-owned open source is an oxymoron. So actually, I want to ask you as a specialist: is vendor-owned open source an oxymoron? Does it have to be?
I don't think it is. I think that it's not very Boolean, right? And I don't think you can treat it as Boolean, right? Which is, you can't automatically say vendor-owned or vendor-controlled open source is bad. And I'll give you an example. The AWS SDK is absolutely vendor-owned. It will never move to a foundation. AWS controls it completely. It's released under open source. And I think there's certainly a place for that type of behavior. What I do think, though, is that there is this continuum of risk that people have to evaluate. And so when making a dependency choice, and I think whether you're looking at this from a sustainability in open source perspective, or alternatively, you're looking at it from a security perspective, the most important thing you can do as you're building something is to heavily curate the dependencies that you're taking. And so choosing to build it on top of a platform is not something that should be taken lightly. It's a serious choice. And one of the factors that you're evaluating is, can somebody continue to maintain this long term? Is there diversity? Is there a license change coming down the path? What kind of guarantees do I have that this thing that I am taking a dependency on and building on top of is going to be here in 3 years or in 5 years, and I will still be able to use it? And that may make a lot of these decisions look like they're more risky, and sometimes they are when there's a single vendor controlling them. But I don't think it's an immediate terrible thing for there to be vendor-controlled open source. I do think it's a factor in that you should be taking into account when you're making those curation decisions.
I think, first of all, as engineers, we know that any single point of failure is always problematic. Even, by the way, if it's not a vendor, if it's a single maintainer, we remember what happened with some Node.js packages like Color and Faker and other things. So even single maintainers that have done that passionately on their own time at some point can flip. And That's one. And with vendors, as we've seen, this does seem to come into a contentious situation where they're not, they see, at least, and it's interesting maybe to look into that, they see that there is a conflict between the community side of things and the business side of things. So I guess when you look at it, what kind of advice maybe can you give these vendors that start an open source, that champion an open source, to make sure that they don't go down this path?
So first, I'd say that running a business is different than running a project, and I think we as consumers of open source also have a responsibility to understand that too. There's some real responsibility when you've got to meet payroll every week, and I don't think we should downplay that. That's a serious responsibility. The thing I would say, and I'm channeling Adam Jacob a little bit here, is that if you're running a business, you need to understand what you're selling. And if the thing you're selling is also the thing you're giving away for free, you're headed for trouble. And I think particularly in the macroeconomic situation that we find ourselves in, where there's no longer next to zero interest rates, the type of VC investments seem a little more constrained, that you're going to have to be able to have a plan to actually generate revenue. And open source is wonderful at a number of things. It's wonderful at providing a base to innovate on top of. It's wonderful at stopping us from having to reinvent the wheel every time we come to a problem. It's amazing at driving innovation, where people are able to collaborate across company lines to deliver something faster and more innovative. What it is not, though, is it's not a business plan. And there's no open source business model per se. Open source is a development methodology, and so I do think a lot of times folks get caught up in the open source is great, I want to do open source, and everything defaults to open source, and all of those are true. That's very different, though, than creating a business around open source software. And I think those two are very different and very challenging things. And in some ways, I think it can be easy to create something that has a thriving and exciting community and lots of use. It can be quite another to create a thriving business. And those two motions are often not even headed in the same direction.
Yeah, I think that you're bringing up a very good point that I keep finding myself needing to clarify, that open source is not a business model. And for all, especially, I'm based in Startup Nation, and lots of entrepreneurs approach me on different questions. And I see that many of them want to, ride this wave of the hype of open source, and they understand that it can go viral and get them a lot of traction. What they don't pay enough attention to, definitely not from the outset, from the get-go, is what part are you giving for free, what part is the open source and community-based, and what part is the business one, where you have your IP, where you have the differentiation on top of that. And many of them go either, as you said, giving all of it as open source, and then finding out that they have an amazing traction for their open source project, but not value in the business side, or the other way, trying to make an open source that very much, how should I put it, maybe castrated. 2.5 nodes, you already need to start paying, and you can't really do anything. And the open source need to stand on its own feet as a viable value. Otherwise, it won't gain community and traction. It needs to be valuable in its own right, independently of your commercial offering around it, on top of it, whether services or product wise or managed services or whatnot.
Yeah, so I get to talk to a lot of AWS partners, and some of the questions that I ask them are, why are you doing open source? How do you decide? How did you come to the decision to open source something? And I've been shocked the number of startups that I get to interact with that don't have an answer for that. Or worse, the answer differs depending upon which person at the company you talk to.
It's becoming a marketing pitch or a sales pitch rather than the core value and strategy of the company.
And I'm not talking about just that coming from developers. The developers disagree with the executives don't even agree with themselves, and so I think that's a real challenge. I think people have preconceived notions about what launching an open source project does for their business, and they all assume that they understand and that they're aligned on the same exact reasons for open sourcing, but they haven't actually had the conversation. And so the first is, why are you participating or moving something to open source in the first place? And then the second question is, how does that advance your business? And that's also a challenge. I talked to a startup a month or so ago, really thriving. They're knocking it out of the park in terms of user adoption, and people really like their product. And I said, this is great, but this is not what you sell. So how's that doing? What's the path that you convert all of these users of your open source project to the thing that you're selling? And it was an awkward conversation because they don't have a plan to move folks from free users to customers. And so I think that's a challenge for any business, right? Identifying your market and getting your market to actually part with money. But I think it's something that startups in particular need to go into the conversation recognizing that the challenge is not getting users most of the time. The challenge is, how do you get customers?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I want to switch now hats to the end users, because talking about misconceptions, I often see that users don't understand how these sorts of things impact them. And to be honest, it's not just their fault. They're not being proficient with open source intricacies, but also all the marketing messages coming around these relicensing moves that promising that the relicensing will not change anything for 99% of the users, or similar statements, which increase the confusion. So can you help clarify for the common user that's not an open source proficient folks, what it means for the users when a project just such as Redis relicenses, or even for your own customers, as much as you hear that first time?
Yeah, so the first thing it does, and so I've run an open source program office in previous jobs, and the first thing it does is that it immediately freezes any consideration of a product or a project as being a dependency. One of the things that I think open source has done well over the past 3 decades is that it has gotten the lawyers comfortable with the terms of mainline licenses. So if you're using BSD, MIT, Apache, even LGPL, GPL, and the Mozilla public license, if you're using one of those, the lawyers understand the terms. They're comfortable with it. The second you move to something that's outside of that, they then want to go research what this actually means. There's no group, and not to speak for lawyers because I'm certainly not one, and this should never be construed as legal advice, but lawyers tend to spend a lot of time talking to each other, especially in places where there's not a huge body of case law. And one of the things that has really, I think, accelerated the consumption of open source is that lawyers became comfortable with a wide swath of licenses. And so the first thing that I've seen, and I've seen this, at prior employers as well, is that when there's a license change, the IP lawyers immediately go, "Whoa, we don't know that license," and then they want to go away and do research, and a lot of friction on consumption, a lot of people trying to understand what the ramifications are. And there's some licenses out there that every single iteration of the license is different. The business software license, BSL, is one of those, because there are no two copies of the BSL that are the same. It's designed to allow you to specify some terms, whether it's terms of how soon after it's going to be open source, what license it will eventually be made available under. And so each one of those requires a deeper inspection than if you were to say, "Oh, this is Apache license." And so that's the first thing that happens. A lot of these licenses are built on the concept that you will essentially not compete with the progenitor of the software. And that can be confusing for some companies.
Because oftentimes it's based on field of use and so on, and then you need to figure out if you fall under this category or not, or might fall later down the road if you start a new product line, or that been retroactively, and all these things that
going back to field of use, right? So I think it's important to think about the follow-on effects, right? I'm going to make things up. This was a real thing, but if there's a license that says you cannot use this in nuclear power, and I don't operate a nuclear reactor, well, I'm probably okay, right? But what if my customer does? Right? So let's say that the US federal government is one of my customers. They operate nuclear reactors. So can I not sell to them? And thinking of the downstream effects of some of the field of use licenses is really important. And I think that also creates a lot of friction, because it's not just what do I do, but what do my customers do? And does that get me into licensing trouble? Particularly when the behavior is not criminal, right? There are legitimate reasons for making some of those available, and it's one of the reasons field of use is not a new thing. The open source community has been grappling with this because people have wanted ethical licenses for some time, but ethics is not something that is consistent across lots of geographies or lots of time. And what one person may find offensive, like nuclear power, another person may say, well, this is the only way we were able to produce green energy at scale. And so it becomes a quagmire where people don't understand what they can do or what they can't. And that uncertainty, in my opinion, drives a lot of people away, drives a lot of users away, and is one of the big concerns that folks have, because it's not just them, it's everybody who's using the thing that they're building or the product that they're selling.
Yeah, and I saw even recently with Terraform relicensing and the way that HashiCorp phrased the license, that a lot of discussion was about, okay, but what happens if, and sort of it essentially came down to the fact that you need to ask them if you're competing or not. Like, it was so vague that people said, okay, how will I know if I compete? And what happens if later down the road I somehow compete with their new endeavors? That it's really a lot of discussion was just about that, and you realize how much variability it adds, that obviously businesses cannot be built when you have such flux underneath. And I want to touch another thing, because we've been talking extensively about the licenses and relicensing and what the licensing terms mean. But it's important for me, and again, in many forums, I emphasize open source is more than a license. And also, when open source turns to the dark side, it doesn't just have to be via relicensing. And we've seen, again, turning even to the recent past year or so, we've seen change of release terms, such as CentOS by Red Hat. We've seen the Linkerd stopping to release deployable artifacts. With the Terraform that I mentioned, it was also the Terraform registry closing its gates to non-certified and other cases. And then the question is back, well, is this open source? And it feels wrong, at least when we know projects like Kubernetes, like PostgreSQL and Linux and others. So I think we need to broaden our perspective beyond the licensing and the copyright aspects, and perhaps the original formal open source definition to better capture how we intuitively grasp open source in a way. Things like open governance, open development, open community. So I'm highly curious to hear your thoughts about that.
So I think it's useful to understand historical context. And one of the big challenges 3 and 4 decades ago, when free software and open source software were at the very beginning, their big constraint was the de facto prohibitions on sharing intellectual property to help other people. And if you look at some of the early free software writings, it was all about subverting the intellectual property regime. And they had things like copyleft to essentially enable them to easily share software with each other, and that was the constraint. And so, when you look at the open source definition today, it is primarily around copyright, and I think we are both. I think that does create a very wide spectrum of what meets the open source definition today.
By the way, just for our audience who don't know, the open source definition is not something vague. It's something very, very concrete that is managed by the OSI, the Open Source Initiative. So it's a well-defined and long-standing article, just for those who are not familiar with the term.
Yeah, and roughly, I think there's right at 24 different elements in the open source definition. So it's something that is very rigid and has a well understood application, and that's a great call out. So OSI, the Open Source Initiative, has been stewarding that definition and also providing a forum to evaluate licenses as to whether or not they meet the open source definition, and that's been a tremendously valuable service they provided to the open source software community. Where
for the audience, I just put the link to the open source definition. I just checked; it's 10 articles for the open source definition, so very concise, as you said.
Yep. And so, as you're evaluating those licenses, that's really has been the constraint. Now, you brought up things like open governance and open development, and I really think that, again, there is a continuum of how open something is, or perhaps how much they've mitigated risk to a user. And so, it's perfectly fine for something today to be vendor controlled, but under an open source license, and that meets the open source definition. Should that meet your threshold for risk, I think that's a little more of a question that depends upon your circumstances. And I do like the Open Infrastructure Foundation. They've got a page that talks about what they think of as the 4 opens. So the Free Software Foundation had the 4 freedoms, which I think are a fascinating way to keep all of the things in your head that make something free software, and a little easier to remember than the 10 items for the open source definition. The 4 opens, though, talk about things that are past the copyright license. So open governance, which means that you know who can make changes, how they make them, and other people can be invited to participate there and have a say in the future. Open development, which means that development decisions are made in the open and not in some smoke-filled back room, and you get to have a voice in conversing about the development and strategic direction of a project. They go on to go through these 4 opens, and I think they're worth considering. I think every time you add, whether it's open governance or open development or some of the others, you are lowering the risk of disruption to a project. And I look at if I'm looking at the things that I think are incredibly resilient, I look at examples like PostgreSQL, which is highly diversified, very open governance, very open development, very open community. They've got a long history of very independent decision making, and I think that PostgreSQL will probably outlive me, and I think that's great. I think they've built something that's incredibly resilient, and that community should be incredibly proud of themselves. And I would have no concerns about taking a dependency on PostgreSQL because, again, I think it'll outlive me.
Yeah, no, it's. I think you're bringing up a good reference. By the way, I also pasted the link for the 4 opens by the Open Infra. They're very, very fascinating read. And I want to say a word about the forks. We talked briefly about Valky, as I mentioned to all our audiences. Do stay tuned for a next episode that's going to be focused about that. But look at the bright side and the point for optimism. We've seen successful forks to keep the relicensed projects open. I mentioned OpenSedge, it was led by your team at AWS. Now Valky, also championed by AWS. OpenTofu by multiple Terraform ecosystem vendors and more. So how do you see the forking activity within this landscape and this dynamics?
So first of all, forking is something we should never want to happen. It's a signal of failure and loss of trust in a project. And while I do think that it is a great pressure relief valve that open source communities have, and the fact that we can exercise them is a great risk mitigation in and of itself. That said, I don't think anyone celebrates the fact that communities are going out and forking. I think that is actually something that we wish happened less. I also think that it is I don't think all forks are successful. As a matter of fact, I'd say the majority of forks probably would not be regarded as a success. And part of that is, if you were not already intimately involved in a project before the fork happened, how do you have the expertise to continue development? And I think that becomes an uphill battle, and I think it adds a lot of stress to a community when they do fork. And so, if I were looking for indicators of whether I think a fork is going to be successful, one of the things I would look for is, are the people who were involved now involved in the new fork? Perhaps the best fork, and they would tell me it's not a fork, that it's just they had to continue operation under a different name, is Jenkins. Now, question for you, and I'm going to put you on the spot. Don't go looking this up.
Hudson.
Okay, so you knew. Okay,
I used it back in the day before. There
are a lot of people who cannot name Hudson. Like if you said, "Where did Jenkins come from?" They can't tell you. But the primary developer of Hudson moved to Jenkins. The community moved to Jenkins, and I think today a lot of people can't remember the name Hudson, and again, the Jenkins community, I think they would say that they did not fork, that they just had to rename their project, and it's all the same people doing the work. They just moved over to a different location to do development.
And I think Valky is, by the way, very, very recent but very current example. As you said, out of the 5, 2 are there. And when I saw that, I don't know if you remember, but at the first days after the relicensing, there are other forks popping up, and it was like in Flux, what's going to happen. When I saw Valky, and by the way, it's documented on a LinkedIn post or something, so you can hold me for that in a few months or a year. But I wrote that I believe this fork will be the leading fork, because I saw who's backing it, who from the maintainers joined it, and the fact that it was from the get-go under a foundation, the Linux Foundation. So a few health signals that for me signals this is the fork that is going to take it. And your team at AWS is one of the founders behind the fork. Actually, interesting. You said how forking is problematic and tearing a community. Why? Maybe interesting to hear why you folks decided to go about this path.
So I think there's an interesting, there's a really interesting timeline. Obviously, AWS was concerned about the relicense, and there were lots of meetings. Madeline Olson, who was one of the maintainers of Redis before the license change, she said, it's great. I understand you're going to have to make a business decision. I'm going to go fork this software, and I'm going to continue working on it, just like I was when it was at Redis. And so she actually, while AWS was still in a bunch of meetings, she forked into her own personal GitHub account, the Redis code base, changed the name to placeholder KV, and suddenly the community seemed to gravitate. And I know we're talking about a period of a few short days, but the other non-Redis limited maintainer joined her and started working there. Pretty soon, 6 of the top 7 non-Redis employed contributors showed up, and it became pretty obvious then that the community that was not employed by Redis Labs or Redis Limited had consolidated around this thing. And so it wasn't so much a choice that AWS said, hey, we're going to go fork something. It was AWS recognizing that the community had consolidated around this fork, and they had already started talking to the Linux Foundation, and there was that recognition. And so I wouldn't say it was so much a motion of AWS taking a lot of action as much as an AWS recognition that the community's here and that's where we need to go.
Oh, that's amazing, because even if the dynamics was such for AWS to react so quickly, and we're talking really about a matter of days, that's astonishing. I escorted OpenSearch. It was excruciating. I don't know, a half a year. First a fork, because the mesh of proprietary and open source was also not the best experience. and not the fork it mentality. And many other things, and suddenly to see that, and I saw OpenTofu, OpenTF as it was originally called, and all of that, and now seeing that in a matter of days, and within 3 weeks, I think less than a month, it's already GA'd under the Linux Foundation and generally available. That's astonishing. So big kudos to the team, and looking at maybe an opportunity to put a spotlight on your team. So you lead the open source strategy in AWS, and let's be frank, AWS is considered like this big scary wolf or behemoth that all of these vendors that we talked about before, when they fork, they talk about AWS as the one that they're trying to protect from, the one that they will take away their open source and monetize on it and leave them without their business or something like that. And I know that you and your team have been doing some good work on this front. So maybe you can tell us a bit about your work.
So we talked a little bit earlier about some of the changes that we're seeing in open source. We talked about how it's evolving from a copyright only focus to being worried about some of the other elements that are important to an open ecosystem and to an open source community. There's also been a journey of AWS. We're evolving in our understanding, and we're starting to recognize that that open source is not a monolith, and you can't treat all open source the same. I talked about some of the risk points earlier around what a user looks at, and we're looking at some of the same things. Who's actually in charge of this? Is it a single vendor? Well, wow, that's a lot of business risks. Is that the kind of risk that we want to take, or do we need to do something to mitigate that? And so I think AWS's understanding of open source is becoming more nuanced, and I think there's also a better understanding of the fact that we're kind of this lumbering giant that can have a big impact on a business one way or another, and I think we're becoming more cognizant of that. Entering into an open source project community is something that has some downstream impacts, and want to be mindful of what those are.
Yeah, for sure. And as I said, I look at it from the sidelines and seeing. I mentioned my trip to San Francisco, and I remember this because it was roughly around the same time with the announcement about the collaboration with Influx Data when Amazon launched InfluxDB, and I caught up with your teammate Spot there at Scale, where we both were on the speaker side, and we're talking about the fact that this is an amazing win, a collaboration, a company that founded a very successful open source, again, a database that are loaded topic in these domains, and making it successful and smooth and collaborative. So I definitely see a transition. And you touched it because we talked about the importance of the role of the foundations, and I'm curious, maybe as a concluding item, you're with a very important role and many years in the Apache Foundation. I have my role, a much more humble role within the CNCF as an ambassador and part of the Linux Foundation. But where do you see the role of foundations within this motion, and where we are heading in the FOSS community and movement?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of roles for foundations, and one of them is providing a vendor neutral place to collaborate. That's really important. People need a place where they can come and actually work on significant problems that everyone has, and so just having a place to come meet is important. The other is that of a steward, and so one of the things that I used to say is that when a project came to the Apache Software Foundation, they were essentially seeking the good housekeeping seal of approval. And I recognize that's an idiomatic expression. In the 60s and 70s in the United States, there was an entity that would essentially label something with a good housekeeping seal of approval, meaning that it was high quality and that you could trust it, much like a CE mark is intended to do in other markets today. But essentially, it was an outward sign that there's some quality met, that there's process in place, like there's actually a security process, and if you file a security bug, you can be relatively assured that it's going to be timely fixed. There's some IP processes to ensure that you're not going to get a surprise from intellectual property issues, and all of those are iterative. And so when a project moves to a foundation, they essentially get the reputation of the foundation to go along with it and say, hey, this isn't just Tomcat, this is Apache Tomcat. And because you know that it's Apache Tomcat, you know that there's a security team who's triaging all of the security reports and getting issues out. You know that that Tomcat has code signing available, and so that you can look and see if it's got a signed certificate saying it's from the Apache Software Foundation. You know that they've got an intellectual property review process, so you don't have to be as concerned. And so I think that foundations are a quick way to build trust, because they will have all of these known processes and policies, and that trust is a little bit transitive with the foundation, right? When something moves to the CNCF, I've got some guarantees about governance. I have some guarantees, not necessarily about success, but I know that there's not going to be a license change. I have some guarantees about security process, not that there's not going to be security issues, but that there's a process there. And as a project moves up at CNCF from sandbox to incubating to graduated, I understand that there's an increasing value to me as a user or a consumer of that software, and that the trust is a little bit higher. And I think that's true across foundations, is that essentially you're getting the trust of the foundation when a project's there, and especially when it becomes a graduated or a top level project. And I think that is very valuable for us as consumers of open source, because we don't have to inspect as deeply when we know that someone else is already doing the inspection for us.
Yeah, I think you said it right, and I think the graduation, people tend to confuse the maturity of the software, which is, like I said, stable. Let's say the equivalent of a generally available that you can install in production on the technical sense, like any software, regardless of open source, and the maturity life cycle within the foundation. In the example of the CNCF, as you mentioned, sandbox, incubating, graduated, where it's more on the vitals of the open source as an open source project. So
Yes.
The diversity, how many use that in production across different organizations, and do you have in place a very clear release policy and release cadence, and all of these things that give you the sense, as you said, that you can trust that this thing will carry on being maintained reliably, maintain SBOMs and many other aspects, security that you emphasized, and is an increasing focus within the CNCF as well as in the Apache Foundation. So all of that, very important to say, and I think you summed it up amazingly well. I want, before we finish, you wanted to highlight the Apache Foundation, the conference that is taking place next week. So do you want to mention that?
So I know you're going to Prague for KCD, right?
Yeah.
But just south of that, in Bratislava, Community Over Code, which is the Apache Software Foundation's annual conference, will be happening next week. We'd love to have folks show up. You can look that up at communityovercode.com.
Yeah, and as mentioned, also from the CNCF side, the Kubernetes Community Days, KCD, Czech and Slovak, is going to take place also next week in Prague, bringing together both cloud native communities, both from the Czech Republic and Slovak. So very interesting to meet. And for me, it's going to be the first time speaking there and actually attending there. So meeting both communities is very exciting for me personally. Sorry that I won't be able to be in Bratislava as well, but great to see these activities in this region. So with that, I think we're on time. So I want to thank you so much, David, for joining me on this episode.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
That me too, and so much more that we can talk that maybe we'll take another opportunity to explore some more areas that we haven't touched. But this is an amazing ending for the 4th season. So really good ending. And for all our listeners, thank you for joining us, and join us also for the 5th edition. All the episodes are available as always on your favorite podcast apps or on YouTube as a video cast. And if you are now listening to that on a podcast, do know that we stream the episodes live on Twitch and YouTube Live, and also on X. So if you follow us on X, on Twitter at OpenObserve to get the live stream times, and also to join the chatter also offline. And stay updated on the next month episode that will be focused on the Valky project, about right after the GA, the general availability of the project and the joining of the Linux Foundation. Lots of good news there. So stay tuned on that. And I'm Dotan Horvitz. Thank you very much for listening. And as always, as I say, may the open source be with you. Thank you very much.